This is part 2 of the Harlem Black History series. If you haven't seen or listened to part 1, I recommend going back and starting there. The content will still make sense if you begin with part 2, but part 1 includes some background information about how Harlem developed, which I think adds some useful context. So we'll pick up with Harlem during the 1930s and the Great Depression. The Great Depression. The Great Depression of the 1930s impacted all races and socioeconomic classes in America. When the market began adjusting, stock prices trended down, investors panicked, and a massive sell-off of stocks occurred. During these economically uncomfortable times, most people and institutions scaled back. Consumers changed their spending patterns, and businesses adjusted by laying off staff and reducing production. Job options for the majority of Black people in the South had been limited to farm work, domestic work, and other low-skilled jobs. Black people, many in the rural South, accounted for about 20% of the people who would receive federal aid. Yet the Social Security Act did not include provisions for farm or domestic workers, leaving them vulnerable in times of need. These circumstances, in addition to openly racist and violent hostility towards Black people, resulted in many families moving to the North in search of work and better opportunities. As unemployment rates increased for positions and industries traditionally dominated by white workers, they began to demand the low-paying jobs that had traditionally been filled by Black workers. Companies, through their own volition and/or outside pressures, laid off Black workers or paid them less. By the time unemployment rates climbed to 30% for white Americans, it had skyrocketed past 50% for Black Americans. This meant that more than half of the Black population could not find jobs, and of those who were able to find employment, many earned meager salaries, which kept their families mired in poverty. Such was the case in Harlem, as it was in Chicago, Atlanta, and other cities and communities with sizable Black populations. Harlem had a history of being neglected by New York City proper due to its relative distance and especially as it became increasingly Black. While created and funded at the federal level, relief programs were mostly managed and implemented by local governments. Black churches and charities initially provided food and other means of aid for the Black community, as some soup kitchens and charities would not serve Black people or provided them with less aid than they did white people. Redlining. The racist practice of redlining prevented many Black residents from obtaining mortgages to purchase homes or loans for new construction and renovations. Redlining was originally developed by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, HOLC maps, which were used by the Federal Housing Administration, FHA, to determine where mortgages would be insured by the federal government. It was a discriminatory practice of setting investment boundaries around particular neighborhoods based at least in part on the race and/or ethnicity of its inhabitants. Urban minority communities were more likely to be redlined, even in comparison to equally poor or poorer white rural communities. Banks used the HOLC maps to determine which neighborhoods were deemed high risk or redlined and were therefore unlikely to have mortgages approved for insurance by the FHA. Thus, multiple banks would be working off the classification of a neighborhood being high risk. Rather than taking into consideration the creditworthiness of the individual requesting the loan, the denial or approval of the loan would be based on the neighborhood's HOLC classification. Most banks would either not offer financial services or investments in the area, while others would, but at predatory interest rates. Historically, a lot of Black people have also been denied loans because they're Black, regardless of the neighborhood where they were looking to buy. The combination of redlining and other facets of institutional racism resulted in many Black Harlemites being locked out of home ownership in Harlem. Some property owners also faced difficulties in obtaining financing for maintaining and renovating properties in Harlem. As a result, many homes and buildings fell into disrepair, with some outright abandoned by their owners. By the 1930s, the only new construction projects taking place in Harlem were government initiatives. Several housing projects were built, which added additional living units but did not help to alleviate the population density issues caused by cramming so many people into a small area. Post-World War II. Though Black people came to demographically dominate Harlem, the community remained economically dominated by Jewish and Italian business owners and landlords. Like some other northern and west coast cities, white homeowners attempted to keep Black people out of their neighborhoods by creating racially restrictive covenants that prevented the sale of homes and other properties to Black people. In addition, many white businesses were willing to sell goods and services to Harlem's black residents but refused to hire them. When white residents fled Harlem, much of the housing was eventually allowed to fall into disrepair. The city began to provide comparatively fewer resources for the neighborhood than it did for others. Black Harlemites were charged relatively high rents despite the aging and poorly maintained housing supply. Over time, black residents found themselves unable to buy properties in Harlem, but also unable to move to other neighborhoods. Early civil rights activists began to lead protests and boycotts against stores and other establishments that operated in the neighborhood but wouldn't hire from within the neighborhood. Increasing tensions and frustrations resulted in riots in 1935 and 1943. In 1941, A. Philip Randolph led a large-scale rally at which he threatened a march on Washington if the government did not address employment discrimination and desegregate the military. President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued an executive order leading to cancellation of the march, but many defense contractors continued to not employ black workers. During and after World War II, Harlem experienced another influx of black Southerners in search of better economic and social opportunities. But the additional increase in residents pushed housing to the brink. Houses were divided up and rented out as rooms, while multiple families squeezed into apartments that were originally intended for single households. The 1950s saw the city further crowding low-income families into newly constructed but poorly planned public housing projects. Despite the enactment of fair housing laws, black people remained crammed into Harlem and other specific neighborhoods around the city. The 1960s to 1990s. Hoping to escape the housing walls of Harlem closing in, as more people arrived and economic opportunities flowed out, many of Harlem's black middle-income residents moved to other boroughs and the suburbs. This further destabilized the community as a greater percentage of those left behind were struggling financially. Harlem managed to keep its title as the Black Mecca through the 1960s and early 1970s as R&B, soul, and funk artists paid homage by performing in its famed venues. Malcolm X lived in Harlem as a young man and led its Nation of Islam mosque after conversion to Islam. Black civil rights activists from around the country stopped by and sometimes stayed in the neighborhood when visiting New York City. A branch of the Black Panthers was established in the late 60s, and several members became quite prominent figures in Black history. Yet Harlem's black culture and psyche would experience a sharp and steep decline. Beginning in the 1970s, the community experienced a drastic increase in drugs, violence, and other indicators of the loss of hope. The owners of some buildings stopped paying taxes and/or abandoned the properties which the city took over and left vacant. The 1980s crack epidemic further devastated the community and held it captive until the 1990s when things began to turn around. Modern Harlem. Unfortunately, Harlem's new economic renaissance was not a result of the black community's economic success, nor were they the primary profiteers. Rather, pockets of the neighborhood experienced a rebirth when Bill Clinton set up his post-presidency business office in Harlem. Seeing an opportunity, developers began to purchase and renovate previously abandoned and poorly maintained buildings. Rents and the prices of homes were relatively cheaper than other areas of Manhattan, so more people began to move uptown. Many black Harlem politicians did not push for programs to allow more black Harlem residents to purchase properties during the neighborhood's decline or its rebirth. Instead, they courted outside real estate developers and smoothed the path for them to begin projects in Harlem. With a wealthier clientele moving in, many long-term Harlem residents who did not own their homes began to find themselves priced out of the neighborhood. For the greater part of the 1900s, Harlem's blackness made it a cultural icon in the world. Its more easily accessible areas are at risk of becoming a cookie-cutter cluster of expensive condos, co-ops, restaurants, and retail stores. Yet the crowded projects are still there, as are the economic imbalances that resulted in their creation. The story of Harlem is still being written, but thus far its history is a textbook case of the discrimination and subjugation of black people, and within that stark reality, the ever-present importance of ownership and economic independence also exists. Harlem Black History Sites. Harlem Hospital Center. Harlem Hospital Center was founded in 1887 and was originally housed in a Victorian mansion located at East 120th Street and the East River. At the time, the hospital only had 54 beds, as its purpose was to serve as a holding facility for patients that would be transferred to other larger nearby hospitals. Harlem Hospital opened during the period when Harlem was transitioning from a rural to urban community, and its population was increasing as people moved further uptown from New York City. Needing additional space to accommodate the growing community, the city began purchasing land in 1900 for a larger hospital site. In 1907, Harlem Hospital relocated to its current location on Lenox Avenue between 136th Street and 137th Street. During this time period, African Americans also began relocating from other parts of New York City and from the South following World War I. Since its founding, the hospital's medical staff had been exclusively white. Black Harlem residents were allowed to receive care at Harlem Hospital, but were treated poorly by the staff in comparison to other races and ethnic groups. A push began for the hospital to hire black medical staff to better address the needs of the community. But in keeping with Harlem's resistance to the arrival of black residents, medical staff at the hospital also pushed back against the hiring of black staff members. When Harlem Hospital finally hired a group of black nurses in 1917, many white nurses quit in protest. 2 years later, the hospital hired its first black doctor, who was also the first black doctor at any New York City hospital, Dr. Lewis T. Wright. As was the case when the first black nurses were hired, several doctors quit. Dr. Wright was initially hired into the lowest MD position at the hospital and was openly antagonized by his white colleagues. The hospital continued to expand as Harlem's population grew and became increasingly black. In 1923, Harlem Hospital established a black training school for nurses, which was later restructured to accept all qualified candidates. A few additional black doctors were hired in the early 1920s, but not in any meaningful amount until almost the end of the decade. In 1958, Dr. Aubrey Maynard performed a life-saving operation on Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. after he was attacked by a mentally unstable woman. Over the years, several notable black medical professionals such as Dr. Patricia E. Bath, Dr. Muriel Pettione, and Goldie Brangman, CRNA, have trained and/or practiced at the hospital. Among other specialties, the hospital is now a Level 1 trauma center and houses a burn unit that specializes in preventing a unique type of scarring that affects the black community. Harlem YMCA. Despite Christian being included in the Young Men's Christian Association's name, the YMCA operated with an official segregation policy from its founding in 1851 through 1946. Black men and boys were not allowed to use the facilities at white YMCAs, but were allowed to establish their own centers. The original Harlem branch of the YMCA was completed in 1919, but was ultimately incapable of accommodating Harlem's growing black population. In 1932, a larger building was constructed across the street from the original site, at 180 West 135th Street between Lexington Avenue and Adam Clayton Powell Jr. Boulevard. The new building was designed to house and serve 4,000 men and 1,000 boys. The lower levels housed space and resources for eating, recreation, and socializing. Harlem had few hotels at the time, and most hotels throughout the city were whites only. Living spaces were located on the upper floors of the Harlem YMCA to provide single and/or traveling black men and boys with accommodations. Malcolm Little, later Malcolm X, stayed at the Harlem YMCA when he arrived in New York City. Other notable figures such as Claude McKay, Langston Hughes, Jackie Robinson, Paul Robeson, and Martin Luther King Jr. either lived or stayed at the Harlem YMCA. The YMCA was desegregated in 1946, but the Harlem Y continued to primarily serve Harlem's black community. The Harlem YMCA is still in operation and has also been serving girls and women since 1955. Sylvias Restaurant. Hailing from Hemingway, South Carolina, Sylvia Woods relocated with her husband Herbert to Harlem. Woods spent 10 years working as a waitress at Johnson's Luncheonette and was offered the opportunity to purchase the business when the owner decided to sell. Short on cash, Woods asked her mother, Julia Presley, to mortgage her farm to assist with the purchase of the business. In 1962, Sylvia's Restaurant opened its doors with 6 booths and 15 stools, just enough seating for 35 customers. The restaurant served soul food, and customers began flocking to the small luncheonette for its fried chicken, catfish, collard greens, mac and cheese, and a bevy of desserts, among other down-home favorites. Sylvia's became the place for not just locals to grab a meal, but also celebrities and politicians visiting the city. As times changed and neighboring establishments relocated or went out of business, Sylvia's expanded into adjacent buildings, growing to 450 seats. The company is still 100% family-owned and is now headed by Woods' son. In addition to the restaurant, the Sylvia's brand also includes a catering company, prepared foods, and cookbooks. The Apollo Theater. The Apollo Theater changed its name once and owners multiple times during the first 20 years of its history. Built in 1913, the building was originally named Hertig and Siemens New Burlesque Theater and operated under that name until a 1933 campaign against burlesque resulted in its closure. As with many clubs and venues at the time, Black people were not allowed to enter or perform at the theater. But that changed when it reopened in 1934 as the 125th Street Apollo Theater. The theater's new owner, Sidney Cohen, the first owner, and Morris Sussman shifted focus to Harlem's growing Black population and not only welcomed Black performers but also began hiring Black stagehands. Most notably, in 1934, the Apollo also launched what would become its iconic Amateur Night. Traditionally held on Wednesday nights from 11 p.m. to midnight, amateurs would be allowed to perform for the Apollo's famously vocal audience. Those who failed to please the audience would be booed and sometimes pulled off stage with a hook by a tap-dancing Howard Sandman Sims. The Apollo eventually became the place to make your name as a rising Black performer. Throughout the 1930s and 1940s, the Apollo grew in prominence as legendary jazz bands performed on its stage. Young Harlemites such as Ella Fitzgerald, Billie Holiday, Lena Horne, Sarah Vaughan, and Pearl Bailey won Amateur Night, which launched their careers. As musical taste shifted in the 1950s and 1960s to R&B and soul, performers working their way up through the Chitlin circuit dreamed of playing the Apollo. Artists such as James Brown, Sam Cooke, Gladys Knight, and the Jackson 5 performed at the Apollo early in their careers and made several return visits. Unfortunately, the number of shows at the Apollo declined in the 1970s when larger mainstream venues began to accommodate Black performers. The theater struggled through changes in management and several unprofitable years. The Apollo Theater was designated a landmark in 1983, was renovated and reopened in 1985, and was acquired by New York State in 1991. The venue is now managed by a private nonprofit which presents concerts as well as a variety of performing arts and community programs. Schomburg Center for Research and Black Culture. The 135th Street branch of the New York Public Library, NYPL, opened its doors in July of 1905. It was one of the city's 65 library branches that were established as a result of a multi-million-dollar donation from Andrew Carnegie. In 1920, when Ernestine Rose became the librarian at the branch, she integrated its staff by adding Catherine Allen Latimer, Roberta Bosley, and Sadie Peterson Delaney to its roster. The NYPL had not employed any Black librarians until 1920 when Latimer was hired. As additional Black librarians were hired by NYPL, many of them were sent to work at the 135th Street branch, as it was the only location that employed Black librarians. During the 1920s, the 135th Street branch came to play an increasingly important role in Harlem's Black community. The library collaborated with local schools and community organizations to encourage library patrons to read regularly. Harlem's first Black art exhibit was organized by the branch, and its success led to it becoming an annual event. The branch also became a meeting place and resource for artists of the Harlem Renaissance. Arturo Alfonso Schomburg immigrated to New York City from Puerto Rico and settled in Harlem in 1891. Schomburg had developed a passion for researching Black history as a child after a teacher stated that Black people had no history. He continued his studies through college and maintained it as a side interest while he worked various jobs to provide for his family. Along the way, Schomburg amassed a formidable collection of books, manuscripts, etchings, paintings, and pamphlets relating to Black literature and culture. Within 3 years of Rose becoming branch librarian and the Black women joining the branch, the community was clamoring for more books by or about Black people. Open to sharing his collection with the public, Schomburg began negotiating a sale with the library. In 1925, the 135th Street branch successfully completed the purchase of Schomburg's collection, and it became the NYPL's division of Negro literature, history, and prints. Schomburg continued to add to the collection and served as its curator from 1932 until he passed away in 1938. 2 years later, the Division of Negro Literature, History, and Prints was renamed the Schomburg Collection of Negro History and Literature in his honor. In the 1970s, the original building at 103 West 135th Street was renovated, and a second site was developed on Lenox Avenue between 135th Street and 136th Street. During this period, the library was named one of the NYPL's 4 research libraries and was listed in the National Registry of Historic Places. The Schomburg Center and the Schomburg Collection have continued to grow over the years. In addition to its research and library facilities, the center now houses exhibition galleries, a theater, and an auditorium. The Schomburg Collection has grown to become the leading library for Black studies and owns numerous first edition and rare books as well as photographs and multimedia. Thanks again for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode, please click the thumbs up button and share it online. I hope you'll also subscribe and return for future episodes to get motivated, get inspired, and get stories of Black history made and in the making. Until next time, take care. For more information about Noir Histoire, visit noirhistoire.com. A link is available in the episode description. There you'll find detailed text, video, and audio for each episode all in one place. While you're there, subscribe to the Noir Histoire newsletter to get fresh content delivered straight to your email inbox. You can also shop for Noir Histoire merchandise and accessories. If you're enjoying the content but would like the option of listening to audio only, you can subscribe to the Noir Histoire podcast via iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. Follow Noir Histoire on Pinterest, Instagram, and Facebook. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.